Okay, so my first question that I have for you is, so in your research, what populations have you observed being the most affected by cardiovascular disease, and um, and why do you think that is?
So that's a really important question. And in fact, it's one of the areas that I focus quite a bit of my work in, health disparities. And there are very notable health disparities with cardiovascular disease, both having an event and also risk factors for cardiovascular disease. And it tends to be individuals that are impoverished or face lots of socioeconomic adversity, irrespective of what their race, ethnicity is, tend to have higher risk of cardiovascular disease. And then many of the minority populations, Hispanic Latinos, African Americans, American Indians, Native Hawaiians, they all have very much elevated risk of cardiovascular disease in our country.
Okay, interesting. And why do you think or know that
Why?
lower,
So that's the $1 million question, right? That's
yeah,
what I've spent the last 20 years of my life trying to answer. I
yeah,
think that it's multifaceted.
okay,
So when we talk about cardiovascular disease, it's a trait that is influenced by both your genetic predisposition and the environmental factors that start from the moment you're of gestation. So in utero, you already have influences, and all throughout your life course, you're going to have the environment, ambient air pollution, the nutritional environment, how much you eat, how much you move around,
lifestyle
all of those
norms.
factors influence, work with your genetics to influence your risk. And we're making great headway at this point in terms of identifying some of the genes that predispose you to cardiovascular disease. And the more we learn about genomic factors, the more we can sort of like target therapies, target interventions, things like that. And what we're learning and understanding more about, we know some of the things that have our knowledge hasn't changed for years and years, and that is like with respect to social disparities, high cholesterol, hypertension, obesity. These are the major risk factors for cardiovascular disease.
Okay. Well, and that segues perfectly into my next question. And I understand you're more of on the genetic aspect, or you study more of the genetics aspect of
Right.
epidemiology, more
Mm-hmm.
specifically CVD.
Mm-hmm.
But during your research and everything that you do, what do you see as being some of the most common causes or influences of all these kinds of cardiovascular disease?
I think that a major critical area that's really rapidly growing is type 2 diabetes. It is rates of type 2 diabetes are absolutely escalating. Children are now developing type 2 diabetes. So this is one of the major risk factors for cardiovascular disease. So that's one trend that's really, really important. Another trend that's important is hypertension. A lot of individuals have unrecognized hypertension, and not only is it unrecognized, but it's undertreated. And this is a major cardiovascular disease risk factor for which there are medicines that we can try and use to make people healthier. So it's sort of lack of knowledge about what, individuals walk around that have type 2 diabetes, that have hypertension. They have no idea, and they're like sort of like ticking time bombs for lack of a better term. So I think that trying to instill trust in minority populations, to seek care, to make sure they have access to care and preventative care. Those are real ways that we can make a big difference right now, I think.
Okay, interesting. And you basically answered this, but I just want to know if you have any other answer to this. What is a way that like an individual can proactively decrease their chances of developing cardiovascular disease?
I mean, I think that there's um, a ton of different ways. I think it's really important that we try and have better preventative care and interaction, going to see your primary care physician every year and
Okay.
having frank conversations about ways that you can decrease risk, and have frank conversations about things that doctors don't want to necessarily be talking about, like obesity and things like that. And our population right now is so obese. However, just doing something like taking walks every day, even in the context of obesity, you can markedly improve your health just by walking a mile every day. So there's real ways that You can make minor changes to lifestyle factors that can help improve your health without being drastic and making the quality of individuals' life suffer for making changes that they may not want to be making.
Okay. So it
So I mean,
sounds like
my answer is take a walk. I think
okay.
that everyone, if you're able, if you're physically able, one of the best things that you can do for health is just increase your physical activity.
Perfect. It also seems like the huge problem with cardiovascular disease is lack of awareness. Is that true?
Lack awareness is a huge problem, especially in undereducated populations, in minority populations, and in populations who have distrust of research and of the medical community. And I've worked in American Indian populations, and they talk to me a lot when I was in the field about how individuals when they go to the doctor, they get an amputation. And that's because diabetes is so prevalent, and by the time they are sick, they go to the doctor, their disease is so severe that they already having downstream problems where they might need to have a limb amputated or something like that.
And this is definitely a difficult question and one that you've been thinking of for a while. But how do you build trust and how do you garner trust in communities that do not have that trust right now?
That's a very hard question.
Yeah.
And I the way that I feel, the way that I've been successful in working with minority populations is to make sure that you don't have some, white individual coming and telling them, trust me, this is how we're going to do it.
A
You need to
like-minded,
go
like look-alike individual member of
exactly.
their community representing them.
You have to have individuals from that community that live in that community, that have trust in that community, to operate the clinics, to make sure that researchers look like the community that you're
That
trying to
makes a
help.
lot of sense.
Yeah, I think that you can't underestimate the importance of that.
Okay. And again, you kind of answered this before, but across all kinds of CBD, what would you say is the most common and most effective kind of treatment?
Oh, I would like to
It's
say
kind of hard
lifestyle.
going across all kinds,
No, no,
but
no. And I would like to say lifestyle intervention works, but it doesn't, it does not. In trial after trial, it does not work. I think the best thing that ever happened for cardiovascular disease were statins. Are you familiar with what statins are? So
I'm
statins
not.
are a life-saving lipid lowering drug that has
Okay.
really almost been magical, and it has really reduced the events, myocardial infarctions, etc. So this has been a life-changing development that it's cheap, it's easy, well tolerated, not lots of not lots of side effects. So I would definitely say that statins have been transformative.
And how do individuals obtain statins and how easy is it to get access to statins?
It's actually quite easy to get access to statins, and it's getting easier because we are now doing more and more trials where we say, even at lower risk, even if your cholesterol is not that high, if we put individuals on statins, does it help? And the answer seems to be yes. So even people who are at pretty low to moderate risk, statins, if high cholesterol is one of their problems, that can be quite helpful. Unfortunately, for other risk factors, we haven't been as successful. There's very limited obesity drugs that work well. Long term, a lot of people can lose weight, but almost nobody in the population can maintain weight loss. And as I mentioned earlier with hypertension, a lot of individuals get on multiple hypertensive drugs and they still cannot control hypertension very well. So we really need some innovation for hypertension medicine. We really need some innovation for obesity medicine. And this is not really like a good epidemiological perspective. For epidemiologists, we want to try and prevent disease. But
Yeah.
unfortunately, a lot of our behavioral interventions are not very effective for a lot of the
Yeah.
risk factors.
Why would you say that like lifestyle intervention is not working, or what do you think the problem is with that?
I think the problem with that is just people have very, very busy lives.
Yeah.
People, we're overscheduled, overburdened, stressed out. And there's really very limited time to promote health. I think that as a country, we do a really poor job of prioritizing health. And I think in other societies where part of their, I think the like elementary school is a perfect example where they're taking away PE. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the exact opposite of what we want to be doing. We want to instill in work days. Let's have, positive reinforcement for if you go and I'll pay for aerobics classes, or I'll give you free yoga or things like that. I think that if we as a country, we really need to think about ways that we can promote health in ways that people can get positive reinforcement as opposed to negative reinforcement.
Interesting.
But negative reinforcement works well as well.
Okay.
In some countries, like the sugar tax, sugar beverage tax, things like that. I think that we need to be creative and think of ways that we can try and influence positive changes.
Yeah, that makes sense. And lastly, this is more of a personal interest question, but I know
Mhm.
that you're again on the genetic aspect of CVD. What have you seen like through genetics, and what have you worked with? And like kind of a hard question to phrase, but what have you seen through genetics being like the most important factors, and like how important do you think genetics are in
I think
causing, influencing CVD?
so most of the way we think about it is, I don't know if when you and were in your biology class in high school and stuff, and or your psychology class, and whether they introduced that concept of um nature and nurture, and
Oh,
how.
yes, of
And
course.
so in my classes, one of the first things that I always say is throw that concept out.
Okay.
It's a false dichotomy. You can't
Okay.
separate the genotype or the genetics from the environmental factors. They're always working together. So
Interesting.
it's commonly held, and it's probably true, that about 50% of your risk of cardiovascular disease is genetic, and about 50% is environmental. That's not to say that having bad genetics is a death sentence. There's lots of
Yeah.
studies now that have shown even individuals who have very high genetic risk, if they counterbalance that with really healthy environments, they can, really reduce their risk or reduce the onset of the disease. What I think has been most monumental and most important for genetics is very recently we've turned to genetics as a target for development of pharmaceuticals. So prior to very recent studies, we didn't have a lot of genetic targets. So genes that we identify that influence traits that are then turned around to develop drugs for conditions. And that recently has changed. And a lot of those drugs are in trials right now, but it looks very promising that using genetics as a start for your target is much more efficacious in developing a drug, or having a drug come to market, than our previous ways of trying to design and develop drugs. And we have some
Wow.
really great early data for some type 2 diabetes drugs, and even some obesity drugs, that suggest that using that genetic target really is bringing to light and really exciting targets that might really help with the burden of disease.
Wow. That was a really good answer. Um, Thank you so much. And those are all the questions I have, but if you